Time now for part two of the listening room. And here again is your host, Robert Sherman.
And now I'm delighted to introduce William and Stephen Mayer. William Mayer we know because we keep playing his music on the station. And Stephen,
Thank you, Bob. Thank you.
Stephen, we know because you were a winner of our Young Artist competition. When was it? I've been trying to
5 years
remember.
ago.
5 years? That long
Almost
ago?
5 years ago. 5 years ago, coming April.
Really?
Mm-hmm.
Then, gee, that must have been one of the very first competitions we had.
I think you had a competition in 1966. Maybe that was the first. This was 1968.
Well, now, where were you then? You were at which school?
I was at Fieldston High School in the Bronx, and at the same time I was at Juilliard Prep.
Mm-hmm. And what's happened in these 5 years?
Well, I've played with several orchestras, and actually a lot of it was a result of that contest.
Really?
Having the good fortune of winning that contest led me to play with the American Symphony in Carnegie Hall.
Mm-hmm.
With
Beethoven Fourth, was it?
Beethoven Fourth Last Movement, right, with Ainsley Cox conducting. And also with Tom Sherman in the Little Orchestra Society Orchestra in Philharmonic Hall. And that was, both of those performances were in the winter of 1970, I believe.
Mm-hmm.
And since then I've played once with the Long Island Chamber Symphony with Signorelli, and have given some recitals here and there.
And Bill Mayer, how have you reacted to having another musician in the family?
It's a little bit frightening sometimes, but really marvelous. Really is.
When did you become a composer? Was this a lifelong situation with you, or did you branch off from another?
It was really rather late. I wanted to be a writer when I was a kid, but I always loved the piano. I wanted to even sleep on the keyboard. Kept wishing I was rather narrow.
Yeah, I was just thinking, I could see it on the top altogether.
That's right, yes. My father was a violinist, an amateur violinist. But it was really in college that I decided I wanted to be a composer. I love poetry, and that was kind of a bridge between the two fields.
So you mean you like the idea of setting text to music?
Very much so, yes. I'm working on an opera right now, based on James Agee's A Death in the Family, and I'm writing the libretto too.
Oh, well, there you are. You're back to a writing.
back to poetry again, yes.
Yeah.
They're really tremendously related, of course.
Mm-hmm. This is an interesting point. There have been so few American operas with what you could really call success stories behind them that have maintained a place in the repertory, that are done and continue to be redone. Isn't this a discouraging factor as you set out on such a massive undertaking? I mean, doesn't it?
Really tremendously, yes.
You don't look like a discouraging person, on the other hand. So.
Well, Agee won a Pulitzer Prize with his work, and the work is beautiful and, of course, well known. But it is discouraging. So many remain on the shelf and so forth. But composing itself is rather a slightly masochistic type of thing in this society. The performances are rather difficult to get. Sometimes there's a huge time lag between when you write something and you get the thing recorded. Like the Andante for strings you play was written 20 years ago. So it's like seeing a friend and saying, you enjoyed his conversation last Tuesday, and meaning last Tuesday 20 years ago.
I would have thought that the Andante would be a work that would be more readily performed because it's so romantic and so easy to listen to even at first encounter.
Yes, well, it is done quite a lot, but to record a work is a very expensive proposition. Right. And the recording of this plus the pastels cost something like $7,500. Made possible through the Ford Foundation, as a matter of fact, which is marvelous.
Do you think of this as you sit down to, let's say you're going to begin a new work, whatever it may be, do you consciously think, because you have worked in a great many styles, as it were, do you have any sort of ticking in the back of your mind that says, now, if I make this very astringent and difficult, nobody's going to play it, and if I make it very romantic and lush, a lot of people are going to play it. Does this enter your thinking at all?
No, Bob, it really doesn't. So hopefully it comes from the inside, yes, yeah.
But I mean, each idea suggests a different approach, a different...
right, yes.
Stephen, what about you? Have you thought of composing after this sort of indoctrination you've been getting?
Not too much, no. I've spent most of my time just working with the piano. In Juilliard, I've, at several points, written compositions for teachers, and I'm generally involved in a course where I have to write one, and I do, and I enjoy it, but I suppose right now it just feels like a matter of time. It's such a demanding thing to be a pianist. There's so much time spent just acquiring the repertory.
And the competition is tremendous too, of course.
Well, sure, yeah. But just acquiring the repertory, practicing, just getting things into position so you can go out and have a career, if you have the good fortune of having one, takes so much time that there hasn't been that much left over.
Well, what is your goal, Stephen? Is it a solo piano career, or is it a combination of teaching or chamber music, or what is it you want?
Right now, I think about a solo career more than anything else. You know, that's what I'm really working for. I don't like to cut out other things completely. For instance, chamber music is something I've enjoyed a lot. This year, I am in a course with Felix Gallimere, the teacher, Juilliard, and he's so marvelously inspiring that I've had as good a time musically in that course as I ever have doing solo work. So I don't like to cut the other areas out, but I think that solo performing is the end all.
It's kind of lonely, though, don't you think? Always having
It is,
the old
yeah.
spotlight on you.
It is a
Being
lonely
separated
thing,
from the
yeah.
crowd.
This is one of the reasons why chamber music is so much fun. You do get to work with other people.
Mr. Mayer, are you a instrumentalist yourself at this point? I mean, do you
A
play?
kind of pianist, not like Stephen. I let Stephen do the work and
I see,
suffer.
I see. Have you,
I can squirm in the audience, but he has to squirm on stage, and I think that's kind of unfair, as
I
a matter of fact.
Well, I talked to you before the program about what music of yours we might represent, and you thought that we could begin with the Elegy from your Brass Quintet. And there's well, not a poem, but a story behind it. Can you just give us the idea of how you came to write this?
Well, it's in memory of a young man, Peter Leiphold, a college student who was killed on the way back to Oberlin College. He's a very talented young man. The work is perhaps the simplest work I've done, but I think one of my best. It's
By
quite
simple,
tough.
You
It's
mean what? You mean in terms of the
well, sometimes
construction
you only hear
form?
one note at a time, mostly. It looked very simple when I first showed it to Robert Nagel, trumpet player. He said it looked like nothing, but he played it, and then each note sounded so terribly important, which made me feel very good. It's quite soft. It's difficult in terms of intonation for the brass players. This is the toughest kind of piece for brass, and also in terms of breath. They really have to have artificial lungs.
Do you think of that when you write a piece, or is it their problem to worry about?
I don't when I'm writing, but later on and looking back, sometimes I have to make changes and so forth. And sometimes I try to imagine myself behind a tuba, and then I do understand. I love to pace up and down and make brass noises and so on.
Well, you aren't making any of the brass noises on this performance, I gather.
No, I'm not. This is
right.
done by the Iowa Brass Quintet. It's a recent recording that CRI put out, and it was chosen by the Saturday Review as one of the best records of the year.
Well, what better recommendation? Very beautiful. The Elegy for Brass Quintet by William Mayer. Mr. Mayer is my guest today, along with his son Stephen. And, well, let's see, how should we proceed? Before we get to the piece you're going to play for us, Steve, I'd like to ask your father just a little bit about the composer's life. I mean, really, what is it like? Are you able to... Personal question, perhaps. If you don't want to answer, you don't have to. But are you able to sustain yourself to make a living as a composer, or do you have to do other things too?
You really have to do other things. I have worked for the USIA. It's really not possible. Usually, you have a loss once you have orchestral parts copied and so forth.
That's why you write a lot of piano music. That's it. Okay.
It is difficult. There's no question, and it's very difficult to get things recorded and so forth. Luckily, I did inherit a few stocks, and I just love the market. I hope thinking that's a musical type of interest. My father was in the market as well as being a violinist, so...
Well, maybe you could... There was a musical about Dow Jones, wasn't there? Maybe you could... your next Brass Quintet...
I like to think that Dow Jones has a musical line, but I've been wrong often before. I have done some teaching at Boston University, but it really isn't possible. Also, I've done some background music for TV, so you've got to do a number of different things.
Well, that at least is in the composing
That's
area,
right.
so
That's right.
That's cricket.
You bet, yes. And ASCAP has been very, very kind to me and to many composers.
In which way?
We get special awards for writing so-called worthwhile music.
I see.
Hopefully it is.
Marty Buxban, who was at QXR for so many years, has been at ASCAP now for quite a time.
Yes, he's doing a beautiful job, yes. Yeah.
So that, glad to feel that we, in some sort of a thread, carry through.
Right, yeah. And fashions change so quickly in composing, you really can't pay attention to them.
Well, that's what I meant. You don't worry about fashions, do you?
No, I think I'm perennially out of style. I was thinking about the tie I'm wearing this morning. It's my favorite, but has a very small knot. I decided that's the secret of my life, but you really do have to write.
Another 3-4 years, that's going to be back in.
That's right. My style will have changed by then, I'm sure.
Now, tell us about the sonata that Stephen will play for us, at least play the first movement. Did you write it for him? Or did you...
Oh, no, it was written quite a few years ago. William Masellos has recorded it for CRI. The work traces a complete circle, really, ending on the same notes that it starts on. It's a 12-tone piece, but it's tonal. The middle part has quite a lot of motion, agitation, and so forth. Makes me think a little bit of clashing chandeliers, if I could say that.
Excuse me, could I stop you for a minute?
You bet.
12-tone music that is tonal, isn't that illegal or something?
Terribly. It's like reaching for that special book on the shelf that you shouldn't.
How do you manage that?
Well, of course, a 12-tone theme can be tremendously tonal. You can just go right down from C to C and so forth, you know.
Start all over.
And start all over again, really. I don't usually write in the 12-tone system, but this seemed to work, and I broke quite a few rules. I love to have rules to start off with, and then I'm quite unfaithful to them. And that makes it a lot of fun.
It's funny, I do the same thing and my boss complains all the time. I don't know why.
And here you are, becoming more successful each day.
Stephen, tell me about your approach to this music. In other words, here was a piece that your father had written. When you started learning it, was there extra weight hanging over your head that you'd better get it right now or something?
No. I feel very close to it, and I always have, this particular movement of the sonata, because it's very lyrical. It has beautiful sonorities, and much of my training has been to produce a beautiful sound on the piano. That was one of the biggest issues.
Is that the Russian school, Steve, they call it?
It was always told to me that it's the Russian school. I'm not sure how accurate that is, but the music is very close to me, and there was no feeling of distance at any point doing it. It was my pleasure to do it, besides the fact that my father wrote it.
Well, it'll be our pleasure to hear it. So will you give us a performance? This is Stephen Mayer playing here in the studio the first movement of his father's sonata for piano. see what you mean by many of your pieces fading.
They kind of fade away into the distance, into the galaxies.
Very, very nice.
Steve does a beautiful job on it.
Indeed he does. The first movement of William Mayer's Sonata for Piano, and performance here in the studio by Stephen Mayer. Now let's see. I think we can go one more notch before we hit a commercial. And it's
going to be O'Dowd this morning?
No, I did that one already.
Oh, you did?
That one.
Yeah.
Yes. I'm sorry, you missed the.
I used them this morning in celebration.
See, now they've had two. How about that? No, the other piece that you are going to play of your father's, Stephen, is called, if I have it right, The Most Important Train.
That's right.
Now, that is a very provocative title which could be taken in all kinds of different directions. What does it mean to you?
Well, it's exactly what it says. It's a train. It sounds just like a train.
choo-choo train?
An old-fashioned choo-choo train with the steam
Not a wedding
bursting
train
out.
or anything else.
No, it starts slowly, it gets closer, it goes faster, it fades away at the end. It's terribly descriptive of a train. I've told my father before, I think a lot of his pieces sound like trains. I think even when he doesn't make any reference to a train, most anything that he writes in a toccata style is going to sound like a train.
But trains are coming back, Bob.
I see.
It's a very self-important train, I should say. It's quite puffy about itself, yeah.
I see. Are you consciously fascinated by trains? You know, Dvorak used to love trains. When he was in New York, every free moment he had, he went up to the Grand Central Yards, 125th Street. And
really?
Look at the trains come in.
Did he write anything to do with them?
Not that I know of,
Yes.
but he used to, in Czechoslovakia, used to go down to the station and apologize to people when they got off the train. If the train was late, he'd go around apologizing to the passengers because he felt that much kinship with the railroad.
Well, I tried to get a feeling of steel in the very beginning with these chords.
Mm-hmm. Have you heard the Villa-Lobos little train?
Yes, I used to play that when I was a kid.
Is there any connection? I mean, is it the same railroad with it falling
I
apart
think this
there?
train is a bit more ponderous and self-important, yes. It has a tremendous ego.
I see. I see. Well, I gave up the railroads a couple of years ago, but I don't see any reason that our listeners should.
Well, I hate to fly, so I really still love the trains. I love overnight trips and so forth.
Mm-hmm. Well, that's a different thing. I was talking about commuting trains.
Oh, commuting trains.
Those are the self-important ones. All right, well, let's hear it. This is The Most Important Train, and again, the composition is William Mayer's, the performance, Stephen Mayer's. The Most Important Train. And this, again, a performance by Stephen Mayer. the composition by his father, William Mayer. Both the Mayers are my guests this morning, and we'll get back to them after we take care of a most important event on this station known as the commercial interlude. We're back in the listening room. We've had our wine, we've had our tea, and we're back with Stephen and William Mayer. Now, William Mayer, one of the pieces of yours that we play fairly regularly is called Two Pastels, and you've suggested that we play one of the two pastels.
Yes.
Which I don't know whether we should call one pastel or just pastel or how we should do it. But here again, you were saying earlier that much of what you do has at least a poetic inspiration somewhere along the line.
Yes, it really does.
Where precisely did you, how did the setting, how did this arise? How did you find the poem, and what made you think of it in music?
I really thought of these lines myself, which are on the program notes. The lines, fresh as the snow and beautiful the footprints left there, someone very great must have passed by.
Your own poem?
They are, yes.
I thought it was some great
It's a little
Walt Whitman or
narcissistic,
something.
I think, for a composer to write his own poetry. But as I was saying in college, I love poetry. In a sense, this was the bridge to my composing, yes. So I'm not quite sure what it means, so I had to express it.
But the poem came first and then the music.
It honestly did, and very often this happens, kind of an image, what have you. I wouldn't call it programmatic music. That's a bad term these days. But the poem really did come first.
And it's the mood that you're trying to
Yes,
capture.
once again, kind of an otherworldly mood. The question, why are we here, and so forth. The big question, you know.
And of course, the term pastel also suggests very delicate orchestral colors.
Well, yes, it's very transparent scoring, and once again, a piano is called for in the score, like so many of my orchestral works. So maybe Steve inherited this love of the piano. I haven't written anything orchestral, I think, without having a piano slip in somewheres along the line.
I see. Orchestras must love you for having to make them drag out the piano.
Oh, yes, there's always that delicious extra charge.
All right, let's listen. The performance is by the Minneapolis Symphony Orchestra under Stanislaw Skrovichevsky, and it's the first of the two pastels by William Mayer. Pastel for orchestra by William Mayer, and the performance, the Minneapolis Symphony under Stanislaw Skrovatchevsky. The premiere of that was when? Do you remember?
That was back in 1960, Bob, with Richard Korn as conductor. Skrovatchevsky was a marvelous conductor in this work. He really asked for his suggestions right from the hall in front of the players, and this is quite unusual. Of course, he's a composer himself, and I think he is having a piece done on QXR this evening.
Which, the English one?
Yes, right.
Well, it's on the same record.
Right.
Remind me to
The
return
station is very economical, I can say that.
Sure, you don't want to pull two records
I
in
must
one
buy
day.
some New York Times stock.
But I better remember to return the record, or we'll have an interlude of all the
Hiatus,
music
yeah.
instead.
Yeah.
Now, you also brought along a recording that I must admit I know nothing about, but it looks absolutely fascinating. It's called Hello World.
Yes.
And that sounds a little bit like the Disney production at the World's Fair, but I guess it isn't.
Well, I got the title when Stephen was born. I kept thinking he might have said Hello World. It sounds terribly corny.
Did you, Stephen?
I never told Stephen that.
I'm sure I did, yeah.
It's a musical trip around the world. It was commissioned by Tom Sherman. And this really earns money, believe it or not, which is incredible for a composer, yes.
Really?
It's been done 4 different seasons by the Philadelphia Orchestra. And it was recorded with Mrs. Roosevelt as narrator and John Langstaff as singer.
Well, we're going to hear just a very short portion of it.
Yes. This was called the Belgian Congo number, but that's out of date now. But Mrs. Roosevelt is saying hello.
Are you planning a revision of this to...
Well, when it's done, it is revised.
you have
The
to keep
Congo Free
updating
State, absolutely, no
every time
question about it.
another country gets assimilated, you have to rewrite your
But
piece.
she was just great doing this work, and by mistake I took her down the freight elevator. I wanted everything to work out right, and this was quite a shock. But and Mrs. Roosevelt, after the recording session, it was almost a disaster, but she carried it off just fine. And there were garbage men there, and they asked her, "How are things, Eleanor?" She started to explain everything to them, and it was kind of indicative of her natural personality.
I see.
She carried it off beautifully.
Well, that's quite an experience. But here is just a little bit of this recording. It is Thomas Sherman conducting, isn't it?
It's Thomas Sherman conducting, yes. It's an RCA recording.
Right, and it's a bit of Hello World.
Can those be drums I hear? They are drums, native drums. Why, we're whirling round the world so fast that we're in Africa, and I didn't even know. I better put on my sun helmet, because we're going deep into the jungle to say hello to all the children who live in the Belgian Congo.
Watch out for lions, we're on our way to wish the Congo. Mbote, Mbote, Mbote.
There is more, but this is just a little sequence.
An hors d'oeuvre.
for you. Yes, from Hello World, written by William Mayer.
And the
And,
librettist is Susan Otto.
I thought maybe Robert Benchley had a hand in it, actually. But, okay, and the narration, Eleanor Roosevelt, and the singer we heard just a bit was John Langstaff.
That's right, yes.
I've always liked John Langstaff's work. He has done some marvelous children's albums that are really
Really
great
tremendous,
songs.
yeah.
Do you often write pieces for children?
Yes, I've done quite a few. I've done a work called The Snow Queen, which has been
That's being done somewhere.
It's being done in
So
Alaska, which is
well, that's
quite-
appropriate. Is that about the one that melts?
No, it's about a wicked
Ice
but beautiful.
Maiden. Sorry, I have the wrong.
Yeah, a wicked but beautiful queen. Yes.
And how do you approach writing for children? I mean, do you have to
Once again,
put yourself in a different mood again?
Well, I think you just have to find that part of yourself, hopefully, that is there, and just go ahead and be fresh about it. I think you just can't write down or you're finished, I think.
Yeah, right.
You really have to enjoy it, and I think hopefully there's that part in all of us, and so hopefully it will surface, and it has pretty many times. And
Very interesting indeed. Now, Stephen Mayer, we have decided that we're going to have one piece not by William Mayer on this program, and it's all your fault.
no,
Because,
I was generous too.
oh, is that what it
My
is?
father likes this piece very much.
Uh-huh. And a fairly decent composer wrote it, right?
I think so.
Yeah, Maurice
a little out
Ravel.
of fashion today, but
Well, can't help that. It's these things have run in cycles.
I don't agree with
his
that,
day will
Steve.
come.
You really mean that?
not
he's
not
played
because-
so much.
No, he's played a lot. In proportion to all the works he wrote, I think he might be the most performed composer.
Yeah. And this is what, the Toccata you're playing? I
That's
lost my
right.
list.
The Toccata from the Tombeau to Couperin suite.
Fine. So this will be Ravel here in the listening room, and the performance, Stephen Mayer. Well, I think the judges knew what they were doing when they awarded Stephen Mayer the prize in our QXR competition. This was 5 years ago. He's come a long way, and it's very exciting to have you with us today, Stephen.
Thank you
playing.
very much.
This was the Ravel Toccata from Tombeau, Couperin. And now, as we head into our finale, William Mayer, we're talking about a work that hasn't been heard yet here, the Messages, right? That's coming
Yes.
up for a premiere.
Premiere on radio, anyhow, yes. It was commissioned by Paul Dunkel, the flutist. And it's for flute, string trio, and percussion.
And what was your concept here? What was it you were
Well,
trying to...
once again, I had some figures in my head. First movement has to do with kind of rustling figures, kind of wind on a lonely plain. And the second movement has to do with drums kind of talking to each other.
Back in the Congo again.
Back in the Congo. And the third movement has instruments hitting themselves, so to speak. I mean,
Well,
string
better for the
players,
players.
and yes, tapping their instruments.
Now we're going to
somebody
hear
answered
the
in the
fourth
balcony. Yeah, we're hearing the fourth movement.
Right.
And this has something to do with Ravel. It's called Ravel Remembered. It has
Oh,
chord structure
how
somewhat.
appropriate.
Yes. And it also has a title, Light Years,
Well, now,
which
could
gives
you-
you a feeling that same old distance that I seem to be trapped
but
with.
Ravel Remembered, did that mean you were using ideas or themes or focuses? What was...
No,
in
it
which
was
way?
it was really the feeling of Ravel.
Okay, let's see. There's something here I'm supposed to see, but I can't find. Oh, yes, you want me to... that. We'll talk about that afterwards. That you have other... I mean, this is just one of many works being performed. Oh, no, we will talk about that, but I'd like the listeners to hear this, which is the fourth movement now, the finale, right?
That's right,
Of
yes.
Messages for flute, string trio, and percussion.
That's right.
The fourth movement of Messages by William Mayer. The performers in this recording the flutist Paul Dunkel, who commissioned.
He commissioned this work
right?
and 8 others this year.
Right. Matter of fact, his last concert is coming up, the 25th of March.
Right.
So he's done marvelous things this year. Anyway, the violinist Eugene Drucker, viola John Graham, cello Fred Sherry, and the percussion Richard Fitz. So we should also mention what we were going to do before and then
Yes.
put till now. Another of your premieres in New York, Bill Mayer, will be at Eleanor Stieber's American Music program on March 26th, which is Monday, a week from Monday at Alice Tully Hall. So
This is a tremendous thrill for me. I've always loved her voice. First heard it on her recording of Knoxville 1915. It's just beautiful. She sings from the inside out. I really feel that. So I feel very flattered, and she's ending her program with this particular song. of mine.
and it's on O'Neill.
That's right,
text.
based on The Great God Brown by...
And in 30 seconds or less, Bill Mayer, what are you up to now? What is your next? What are you working on?
Well, I'm working on this opera, Death in the Family, by James Agee, and I hope to do a percussion concerto, and the Boston Symphony Players are doing messages, by the way, which I'm glad to say, and they've asked me for a piece.
Fine.
But I'm anxious to finish this opera. I have been bogged down a bit. I made some real progress at McDowell Colony, and perhaps I'll go back there.
Okay, I have to cut you off because our time is up. But thank you very much, Bill Mayer and Stephen. It's
been a
great
pleasure.
morning having you.
Thank you, Bob.
Tomorrow we'll meet the 3 musicians who call themselves Music by 3, Nabucco Imai, Ursula Oppens, and Michael Webster. And on our second hour, Pilar Loringar. See you tomorrow morning in the listening room.
This is the radio station of the New York Times.